September 15th, 1940, London, England. 22:14 hours. The sky is burning. Searchlights cut through the smoke like white blades, slashing across the underbelly of a German Heinkel formation as it drones over the Thames. Below, the city is a trembling sea of fire, warehouses collapsing in sparks, sirens echoing through the choking haze, and anti-aircraft batteries hammering upward with thunder that shakes the cobblestones. Inside a cramped RAF operations room beneath Uxbridge, Flight Lieutenant Robert Harris leans over a plotting table illuminated only by red lamps. Sweat forms at his temple, not from heat, but from the weight of calculation. Tonight's raid is larger, faster, more coordinated. Britain is running out of time. A breathless runner stumbles in from the corridor. "Sector control to all groups. Scrambles confirmed. 24 bombers inbound. ETA 7 minutes." Harris exhales sharply. 7 minutes. That is nothing. Above him, on the surface, hurricanes already roar down the runways, their Merlin engines screaming as they claw into the night. But even as they take off, everyone in the operations room knows the truth. Fighter interception alone cannot stop this. Sooner or later, Britain will have to strike back, not with desperation, but with precision. And precision is something the Royal Air Force does not yet possess. Not with its current bomb-sighting equipment, not against the speed and altitude of modern warfare. The defenders of Britain cannot hit what they cannot accurately measure. And this is where the story shifts far from London. Hundreds of miles to the east, across devastated plains, fallen cities, and a homeland carved apart by two invading powers, an engineer named Jerzy Rudlicki is on the move. A man carrying nothing but a suitcase, a roll of secret sketches, and the last hope of a nation that no longer exists on any map. The sound of bombs thundering through London tonight is the same sound that once echoed over Warsaw, Lwów, and every retreating column of Polish resistance. Rudlicki remembers it vividly. He had been designing aircraft, solving aerodynamic puzzles, improving stability systems, work that once felt like future building. Then the future burned. But exile did not break him. Instead, it sharpened him. And now, after months of escape routes, false documents, and narrow crossings through Romania and France, he has reached the one place still willing to fight the tidal wave threatening to consume Europe: Britain. And Britain, though bruised and burning, is a place that listens. On the very night the Luftwaffe unleashes one of the heaviest raids yet recorded, Rudlicki sits inside a dimly lit workshop on the outskirts of RAF Hucknall. Engineers around him pull all-nighters, welding frames, wiring prototypes, adjusting mechanisms on half-finished bombers. He rests one blueprint on the table, the design he believes could give the RAF the edge it so desperately needs, a bomb-sighting principle unlike anything standard in British service. More stable, more responsive, more intuitive for pilots under stress. The kind of sight that gives a bomber crew what Britain lacks tonight: accuracy, when accuracy means survival. As the ground trembles from distant explosions, Rudlicki's pencil moves across the page. He draws stabilizing fins, rotating elements, a sighting mechanism that compensates for drift and turbulence, concepts he first tested in Poland and refined under fire. Behind him, a senior RAF engineer pauses, watching silently. "Jerzy, do you really think this can work?" Rudlicki barely looks up. "It has to. Because if Britain falls, there is nowhere left to run." Outside, the sky glows orange. Fire stretch the horizon. Inside, a Polish engineer begins the work that will help Britain survive its darkest hour. The door to the workshop swung shut behind the RAF engineer, leaving Jerzy Rudlicki alone with the scattered blueprints, the faint hum of machinery, and the distant thunder of German bombs. He rubbed his tired eyes, knowing that somewhere across Britain, dozens of other Polish engineers were fighting the same quiet war, with pencils, calipers, and minds sharpened by catastrophe.
Most of them had arrived the same way he had, running, hiding, crossing mountains, rivers, and borders under the cover of darkness. Men like Yusuf Kasatsky, who brought the first fully functional portable mine detector. Men like Stanislaw Ulam, whose mathematical intuition would one day reshape physics. And pilots, dozens of them, already writing legends in the skies above Britain. At Hucknall, however, the work was more intimate, quiet, technical. The kind of work no newspaper would ever mention, but every bomber crew would one day rely on. A sudden cough echoed from the far corner of the room. "Jerzy, you're still at it." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Stefan Nadachowski, another Polish expatriate and one of the sharpest test pilots that the RAF had borrowed. He stepped forward, wiping grease from his hands. Rudlicki gestured at the open blueprint. "Take a look." Nadachowski leaned over, studying the curvature of the stabilizer assembly and the alignment of the gyroscopic unit. His brow furrowed. "You're compensating for lateral slip." Rudlicki nodded. "And pitch drift. The old British sight averages direction over time. Mine reacts instantly. Pilots won't need to fight turbulence to get a stable line." Nadachowski let out a long breath. "That could change everything." "Not could, but will." The ground trembled, a low, rolling quake that drifted through the workshop. Another explosion. Maybe two. Both men paused instinctively, listening. "You hear that?" Nadachowski murmured. "That's why we don't stop working." At dawn, the engineers carried the prototype to the hangar. A single, awkward-looking frame bristling with screws and aluminum fittings. Outside, the airfield was crowded with damaged bombers limping home from night sorties. Some had holes the size of fists in their fuselage. Others landed with one engine coughing dangerously. Crews emerged exhausted, faces ghostly white beneath smudges of oil and soot. A young British airman, barely 20, pointed at the contraption between Rudlicki and Nadachowski. "Is that another one of your Polish contraptions?" he asked with a nervous grin. Rudlicki smiled. "Not a contraption, a solution." They mounted the prototype inside a test aircraft, a modified ferry battle, where early morning frost clung to the glass canopy. The bomber's interior smelled of cold metal, oil, and canvas straps worn thin by too many missions. Nadachowski slid into the pilot's seat. "Ready?" "As ready as the British Empire," Rudlicki replied, settling beside the new sighting frame. The engine kicked to life, rattling the cockpit until every bolt hummed. The plane rolled down the runway, wheels thundering over the frosted ground, and then climbed slowly into a pale orange sunrise. Beneath them, the airfield shrank away, replaced by patchwork farmland and distant villages still asleep. At 4,000 feet, Rudlicki began the first calibration. Air turbulence buffeted the cockpit. Not much, just enough to ruin a bomb run. But this time, the sight barely shook. The stabilizer Rudlicki had designed absorbed the motion, keeping the crosshairs steady. Even as the aircraft banked, the mechanism responded instantly. Nadachowski glanced over, stunned. "Jerzy, it's holding even in the turn." Rudlicki's heart thumped. "Then we're close." He tested the drift compensator, then the angle correction knob, then the vertical alignment. Every adjustment worked. Not flawlessly, not yet, but well enough that a British bomber could hit a factory rather than a forest, a warship rather than open sea.
When they landed, RAF officials were already waiting. Rudlicki climbed down from the bomber, wind still in his hair, and handed the flight notes to a commander who had slept even less than he had. The commander skimmed the sheet, looked up and asked, "How soon can you finish a production model?"
Rudlicki didn't hesitate. "As soon as you're ready to win the next battle." The commander nodded slowly. "We're ready," he said. Behind them, London's skyline still smoldered in the distance, but for the first time in weeks, something like hope rose with the morning light. The commander folded Rudlicki's test notes and tucked them beneath his arm as the cold morning wind swept across the airfield. The night's raids had left a thin coat of ash drifting from the direction of London, a grim reminder of the urgency hanging over every conversation, every design, every flight. "Come with me," the commander said. He led Rudlicki inside a makeshift office assembled from spare timber and corrugated steel. Inside, several RAF officers huddled around a chart of bombing results from the past 2 months. The numbers were brutal. Too many missed targets, too many wasted sorties, too little time left before Britain's reserves were drained dry. As the officers turned, Rudlicki sensed the skepticism in their eyes. Not hostility, but exhaustion. They had been promised wonders before: experimental sites, improved drift instruments, new training methods. None had changed the tide. The commander gestured toward the Polish engineer. "Gentlemen, meet the man who may have just solved our accuracy problem." A long silence followed. Then a wing commander with dark circles under his eyes spoke. "Mr. Rudlicki, we've been told your stabilizing sight compensated for drift during a banked turn." "It did. Not perfectly, but significantly better than your current systems." Another officer leaned forward. "How fast can you refine it?" "As fast as your workshops can build." The officers exchanged glances. Something unspoken passed between them. The cautious hope of men who have run out of alternatives. Finally, the wing commander nodded. "Then you'll have full access to Hucknall's manufacturing wing. Whatever equipment you need, ask. Whatever personnel you require, you'll have them." Rudlicki inhaled deeply. "Then let's begin." The following days became a blur of soldering irons, chalk-marked boards, and aviation fuel. The workshops hummed with ceaseless energy, as if every bolt tightened and every bracket fitted was a blow struck against the Luftwaffe. British engineers gathered around Rudlicki's diagrams, absorbing his methods. He explained the stabilizer fins, the gyroscopic alignment, the responsive drift mechanism. Details that seemed almost futuristic compared to older British designs. One technician, adjusting the mounting bracket, marveled aloud. "You Poles, you brought half your country's future tech with you." Rudlicki didn't look up from his sketch. "The future of Poland is here now, so we must use it." Meanwhile, test flights continued, each one flying through the wake turbulence of returning bombers. Aircraft patched with aluminum plates, engines sputtering, crews exhausted. Yet every man on the ground knew, if this new sight worked, their suffering would mean something. On the third test flight, Rudlicki climbed into the cockpit of a Bristol Blenheim, alongside a British pilot named Flight Officer Peter Grantham. A tall, quiet man with steady hands and a haunted look. As they ascended through broken clouds, Grantham finally spoke. "I lost my brother over Rotterdam. Flak got him. But the run, they said the bombs were off by nearly half a mile." "I'm sorry," Rudlicki said. Grantham shook his head. "If your sight can tighten our spread, well, maybe we lose fewer brothers."
The aircraft leveled out at 6,000 feet. Grantham lined up on a test range marked with white chalk targets. Turbulence hit them, a quick, sharp wave, the kind that usually ruined sight alignment. But this time, the stabilizer held. Grantham checked the crosshairs. Steady, steady. He released the practice charge. The impact plume erupted just meters from the target center. He exhaled sharply. Dear God, Jerzy, you've done it. They made 3 more passes. All 3 were near perfect. The 4th was dead center. When they landed, Grantham jumped from the cockpit and embraced Rudlicki in a spontaneous, unrestrained gesture that startled the nearby ground crew. That afternoon, an urgent message was sent to RAF Bomber Command headquarters. By evening, a courier arrived at Hucknall with orders. Proceed to expedited production and prepare integration for operational squadrons. For the first time since the Blitz began, the RAF wasn't just fighting to survive. It was preparing to strike back with something new, something sharper, something built from exile and desperation. A weapon born not from explosions, but from mathematics, metal, and the stubborn will of a Polish engineer who refused to give up. Snow flurries drifted over Hucknall as the first production units of Rudlicki's bombsight were loaded into wooden crates. The crates themselves looked unimpressive. Rough pine boards, stenciled with RAF serial numbers and a single word in black ink. Precise. But inside each one rested the polished brass and aluminum assemblies that represented a turning point. The moment the RAF could finally see its enemy with clarity. A convoy of Bedford trucks rumbled toward the main road, heading deep into the Midlands, where bomber squadrons awaited their new equipment. Rudlicki walked beside the last truck, hands buried in his coat pockets, watching clouded breath drift into the frozen air. "You should be proud," Nadenchowski said, stepping up beside him. "Pride can come later," Rudlicki replied. "For now, the crews must learn how to use it." And so the next chapter began. RAF No. 44 Squadron, flying Hamptons and early Wellingtons, received the first shipment. The training hall inside their base, a converted barn that still smelled faintly of hay, filled with pilots, navigators, and bombardiers who had grown all too used to failure. A veteran bombardier with silver stubble leaned over the new sight mounted on a wooden mock-up. "So this stabilizes itself?" he asked skeptically. Rudlicki adjusted the frame. "Not by magic, by mathematics." The crews laughed softly, tension easing. Rudlicki continued, "This sight responds instantly to slip and tilt. Your accuracy improves the moment you stop fighting the instrument and start trusting it." A young bombardier raised his hand. "Sir, does it work in turbulence? Real turbulence, I mean, the kind you get when the flak bursts near your tailplane?" Rudlicki gave a faint smile. "I designed it in a country at war. I assure you, it understands turbulence." Nervous chuckles echoed through the hall. The training lasted hours. Crews practiced adjusting the device, calculating drift, and sighting targets projected on a canvas screen pulled taut across one wall. Men who had become grimly accustomed to fumbling with outdated equipment now found themselves recalibrating effortlessly, fluidly, even confidently. During a break, Flight Officer Grantham entered the hall, still smelling of engine exhaust. He strode toward the front. "Listen up," he called out. "I've flown with this sight 3 times now. That's 3 more times than most of you. And let me tell you, it works. It works even when the aircraft doesn't want to." He tapped the metal frame of the sight with 2 knuckles. "This little thing may save your life, and more importantly, it might help end this bloody nightmare." A week later,
The first operational sortie featuring the Rudlicki site rolled down the runway at RAF Waddington. A formation of Wellington bombers, engines low and menacing, crept into the night sky, their silhouettes vanishing into moonlit clouds. Rudlicki stood at the edge of the field, bundled against the wind, watching the aircraft become smaller and smaller until they were no more than shimmering stars. Nadakovsky stepped beside him. "Nervous?" "I trust the sight," Rudlicki murmured, "but war has a way of mocking trust." They waited. Hours passed. The temperature dropped. Dew formed on the fence rails. A fox darted across the far hedgerow. Then, faintly at first, the drone of returning engines reached them. One by one, the Wellingtons appeared through the pre-dawn haze, landing with gentle thuds and rolling to a halt. Ground crews sprinted out, commanders gathered. The air seemed to hold its breath. Grantham emerged first. His boots hit the tarmac with purpose. "Jerzy, come here." Rudlicki approached, anxiety and anticipation wrestling in his chest. Grantham pulled him aside. "We hit the marshalling yard. Directly. You understand? Directly. The photos will confirm it when the cameras are developed." Rudlicki closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. Grantham wasn't finished. And not just us. 3 other crews logged near-perfect placements. The Germans won't like waking up to that. Another Wellington rolled in, its nose lights casting long shadows. The bombardier jumped down and shouted to anyone who would listen. "Whoever built that new site, buy him a drink!" Laughter rippled through the hangar. But Rudlicki only stood there quietly, absorbing the moment. It was not victory, not yet, but it was momentum. It was proof. It was Britain refusing to kneel. Behind him, the sun began to rise over the airfield, painting the clouds a deep gold. Hope, for the first time in months, felt solid. By late January 1941, a quiet transformation had begun inside RAF Bomber Command, not announced on posters, not written in newspapers, not even whispered in pubs, but felt unmistakably by the men who flew through darkness. The Rudlicki site had begun to spread. Squadrons in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and Norfolk received the new stabilizing assemblies. Training officers reported shorter learning curves, fewer aborted runs, and dramatically tighter bombing patterns. Word traveled not through official channels, but through the smoke-filled crew rooms where pilots spoke in low voices after missions. Try the Polish site. It holds even when the flak knocks you sideways. You can trust it in a dive. It doesn't panic when you do. And slowly, night after night, the German war machine felt the difference. On a freezing, moonless night in February, the entire crew of a Wellington from No. 149 Squadron crouched around a reconnaissance table, studying aerial photographs developed just minutes before. Prints still glistened with moisture, the chemical smell cutting through the scent of fuel and burnt cordite. The squadron commander pointed with a pencil. "This," he said, tapping a cluster of smudged rectangles, "is the target, the synthetic oil plant at Gelsenkirchen. High value, high flak. They expect us." He slid a fresh photo across the table, the result of a test run earlier that evening. "And this," he said more quietly, "is what a Rudlicki-equipped crew can do." The photo showed a white crater almost dead center on the chalked practice target. No drift, no wild scatter, no wasted tonnage. The bombardier who took that shot, a lanky, soft-spoken man named Corporal Drew, spoke up. "It's not just the steadiness," he said. "It reacts before I do. When the pilot banks, the sight corrects immediately, doesn't wait for the air to settle. A veteran rear gunner whistled. About time we had something that worked in our favor. The commander folded the photos and addressed them all. Tonight, gentlemen, we fly with purpose. We're not guessing anymore. We're placing our strikes. Meanwhile, at Hucknall, Rudlicki continued refining the design. Sleep came in short, scattered bursts. Meals were whatever scraps he remembered to eat between calibration sessions. His hands grew stained with oil and graphite. But each improvement, a smoother rotation assembly, a stronger stabilizer fin, a more responsive alignment gear, saved lives. One evening, as he tightened a bolt on an updated prototype, a young RAF technician approached him. "Sir," the technician said, hesitating, "my brother flies in 76 Squadron. They just received your sight." Rudlicki nodded gently. "I hope it serves him well." The technician's voice wavered. "It already has. He said it was the only reason they hit the target last night. The wind was impossible." Rudlicki paused, swallowing the sudden tightness in his throat. "Tell him," he began softly, then stopped. What could he say? That a man without a country had poured every memory, every loss, every lesson written in fire into that piece of machinery. That every improvement was an answer to the destruction he'd witnessed in Poland. That he was fighting to avenge a homeland he could no longer protect. In the end, he said simply, "Tell him to come home safe." As winter gave way to early spring, the War Office compiled the first classified statistics reports comparing bombing accuracy before and after the adoption of the Polish sight. The difference was staggering. Strikes previously landing hundreds of meters off target now fell within tens. Supply depots, rail yards, and industrial plants suffered sustained damage. German commanders reported increased repair times. Anti-aircraft batteries worked frantically, yet more RAF bombers were returning with their mission completed. For the first time since the Blitz began, British High Command looked at the charts and saw a line bending upward, faintly but unmistakably. Hope wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was measurable. And Bomber Command wasn't the only one taking notice. Within the halls of the Air Ministry, senior strategists gathered in dim conference rooms, maps spread out across tables like battlefields. They discussed the same Polish name again and again, Rudlicki. One of the officers, an aging air commodore whose tired eyes had seen every phase of the war so far, said it plainly. "We must accelerate integration. If this sight gives us even a 15% improvement in accuracy, it will change the night war." The others nodded. No one disagreed. Outside, the factory lights in Hucknall burned through the night, just as they had through the darkest days of the Blitz, illuminating rows of workbenches where British and Polish hands labored side by side. Quietly, relentlessly, they were reshaping the RAF's ability to strike back. And the enemy had no idea that the shift had already begun. March 12th, 1941. Somewhere over the Ruhr, 17,000 feet above a continent in chains. The sky was black and starless, a suffocating void broken only by the orange blossoms of flak bursts erupting around the RAF bomber stream. The German searchlights hunted wildly, stabbing upward in pale beams that cut the darkness like spears of glass. In the cockpit of a Wellington from No. 149 Squadron, Flight Officer Grantham gripped the control column, fighting the turbulent air rushing around the aircraft. Every explosion rocked the fuselage, rattling metal panels and shaking loose frost from the window frames. In the bomb bay below, Corporal Drew crouched over the new Rudlicki sight, his gloved fingers adjusting the alignment knob with clockmaker precision. "Target in 90 seconds, he called. Grantham banked slightly to port. The flak intensified.
"Hold her steady, Teeter," Drew shouted over the roar. "Tell Rudlicki to invent something that stops German gunners from being so bloody accurate," Grantham yelled back. Another blast. The aircraft lurched downward before stabilizing, but Drew barely flinched. The crosshairs steadied themselves instantly, as if anchored to something the storm couldn't touch. "So long as the sight holds, so do we," Drew muttered. The searchlight swept across the bomber's belly, a near catch, the beam grazing the underside like a giant fingertip trying to pin the moth to the sky. "Bombs ready?" Drew whispered. The target, a chemical processing facility critical to the German synthetic fuel program, appeared through the haze as a cluster of geometric shapes glowing faintly in the moonbreaks. Steady, steady. The flak burst again, violently enough to tilt the plane, but the sight corrected instantly. The crosshairs barely drifted. "Now!" Drew pulled the release. A jolt, a metallic clank, then silence. 5 seconds later, blooming far below, a perfect blossom of flame erupted at the heart of the complex. Dead center. Not a scatter, not a guess, a placement. Other bombers followed, their dropping patterns unusually tight, each one guided by the same Polish innovation now humming quietly inside their cabins. When the formation banked away, the entire facility burned in a rising column of fire visible for miles. At an observation post on the German side, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer frowned at the damage reports being handed to him by trembling sentries. "This is not normal dispersion," he muttered. He studied the glowing map on his table, red pins marking recent British strikes. Something was changing. The RAF hadn't suddenly become lucky. Their accuracy had begun improving weeks ago, steadily, relentlessly. "Have the British developed a new bombsight?" he asked. A junior officer swallowed nervously. "We don't know, sir, but crews report that the formations are dropping with a consistency we have not seen before." The senior officer scowled. "Find out how." But he would not find out. Not yet. Not until the war was already shifting.
Back in Britain, long before the bombers returned home, the night shift workers at Hucknall continued assembling more stabilizing frames. Sparks flew. Drills buzzed. Stacks of half-finished sights lined the benches like metallic ribs waiting for a beating heart. Rudlicki was there, as always. Bent over a work table, sleeves rolled past his elbows, he adjusted the angle of a new gyroscopic spindle while technicians watched quietly, learning the subtleties he never needed to explain on paper. A mechanic approached with a clipboard. "Sir, photos just came in from tonight's raid." Rudlicki froze. "Let me see." The mechanic handed him 3 still damp photographs showing impact clusters with unprecedented precision. One strike pattern formed a grouping so tight it looked unreal, as if drawn by hand. Rudlicki exhaled slowly, almost trembling. Nadowski stepped behind him. "You've done more than design an instrument, Jerzy. You've given them a way to fight back." But Rudlicki shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I've given them a way to choose what they hit. That is the difference between fighting a war and surviving one." Outside, the returning bombers roared overhead, wheels screeching across runways slick with dew. Pilots stumbled from their cockpits, exhausted yet alive. Men who owed their survival to dozens of small advantages. And one remarkable Polish engineer who refused to let Britain fight blind. The morning after the Gelsenkirchen raid, the briefing room at RAF Waddington buzzed with an energy the war had not seen in months. Air crews gathered around tables, cluttered with reconnaissance photos, coffee mugs, and the unmistakable scent of burned aviation fuel lingering on their uniforms. A film projector hummed to life, casting grainy black and white images across the wall. The first frame appeared. A crater, massive, sharply defined, sitting almost perfectly at the center of the refinery's processing yard. Pipes ruptured, storage tanks smashed open like tin toys.
smoke pouring upward in thick, oily columns. A murmur rolled through the room. The intelligence officer clicked to the next slide. Then another. Then another. Each showed similar precision, each confirming what the crews already knew in their bones. The RAF's bombing had changed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officer said, lowering the projector screen, "last night's operation inflicted significant disruption to enemy production. Repair crews will be overwhelmed. Logistics will be slowed. This was unprecedented." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "And much of that accuracy is owed to the integration of the new Polish sighting mechanism developed at Hucknall." Heads turned toward the back of the room. Jerzy Rudlicki stood there, quietly, hands clasped, not expecting to be singled out. He had come only to observe, to learn, to understand how the crews used his work. But suddenly, he felt dozens of eyes on him. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers. Men who had risked their lives mere hours before. One by one, they began to applaud. Not loudly, not ceremonially, but steadily, respectfully, with the weary gratitude of men who had seen too many friends vanish into the night. Rudlicki swallowed hard, lowering his gaze. He had never built the site for applause. He had built it for survival.
"You know," the pilot said, adjusting his flight jacket, "if this war ends sooner, it'll be because of things like what you've made." Rudlicki shook his head. "No, wars end because of the men who fly, not the tools." Grantham half smiled. "Tools help." They walked together past the row of Wellingtons, each patched and scarred, each proudly wearing the soot of last night's mission. Ground crews serviced engines, replaced panels, and checked landing gears worn thin by repeated emergency returns. "Funny," Grantham mused, "how a little thing like a stabilizer becomes the difference between hitting a factory and hitting an empty field." "It's never little," Rudlicki said softly. "The smallest improvement can change a war's trajectory." He didn't say the rest. He had learned that lesson in Poland, where the smallest miscalculation, one delayed order, one misread intention, had cost a nation its freedom. But not everyone welcomed the Polish engineers' success. A senior RAF official, a man known more for politics than engineering, arrived unannounced at Hucknall that afternoon. He carried himself with the confident stiffness of someone who believed he already understood everything he needed to. He watched technicians assembling the sites with narrowed eyes. "So this is the miracle device," he said flatly. "It is not a miracle. It is engineering." The official walked around the table, examining a finished unit. "British engineering was perfectly adequate before the war." "And yet," Rudlicki replied carefully, "Britain was losing bombing accuracy month after month until we introduced this design." Several technicians froze. The tension thickened.
But the official had no retort. He simply sniffed, muttered something about foreign methods, and departed as abruptly as he had arrived. As the door closed, Nadachowski leaned in. "You handled that well." "Politicians do not frighten me," Rudlicki murmured. "What does then?" Rudlicki tightened a bolt, his voice quiet but firm. "Failure. I fear failure more than any bureaucrat." That evening, Hucknall's engineers received a classified courier note stamped with the wax seal of the Air Ministry. Rudlicki unfolded it at his workbench. Effective immediately,
RAF Bomber Command authorizes full-scale production and deployment of the Rudlicki stabilized bombsight across all operational night squadrons. Units are to receive installation priority following crew readiness evaluations. Signed, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal. Nadachowski whistled softly. That's it, Jerzy. That's the turning point. But Rudlicki stared at the paper without celebrating. This means more responsibility, more expectations. And, Nadachowski added, clapping a hand on his shoulder, it means the site worked when Britain needed it most. Rudlicki looked out across the workshop. The glowing lamps, the scattered blueprints, the steady clatter of tools shaping metal into precision. Somewhere far to the south, London still smoldered in places. But its fires no longer symbolized helplessness. Now, they symbolized resolve.
And Britain finally had the means to answer back. London, autumn 1940. Night after night, the sirens wailed across the city like the cry of some wounded steel giant. The Luftwaffe's Heinkel and Dornier bombers crossed the channel in waves, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Below them, searchlights sliced the darkness, clawing desperately at the sky. Anti-aircraft guns hammered upward, their reports echoing between shattered buildings. Inside a Royal Air Force engineering hangar on the outskirts of Uxbridge, the world felt strangely quiet. A single lamp buzzed above a metal workbench. Its pale light spilled across brass gears, glass lenses, and the partially assembled frame of a sighting device. Jerzy Rudlicki leaned over it with the intensity of a surgeon, his sleeves rolled up past the elbows, his fingers stained with graphite. The walls trembled occasionally from distant explosions, but he didn't flinch. Britain was being bombed, but this was the weapon he could fight with. Behind him, Squadron Leader Alan Marshall approached, his boots clicking sharply on the concrete floor. He paused, watching the Polish engineer adjust a delicate compensating cylinder. "Rudlicki, the air staff wants a demonstration tomorrow. They think this stabilizing sight of yours may give our boys a chance to hit back." Jerzy didn't look up at first. He rotated the glass housing, listening to the faint hum of gyroscopic motion. Only when the mechanism balanced perfectly did he exhale. "It will work," he said simply. Marshall crossed his arms. "A lot of men are praying you're right." Hours later, dawn broke gray and cold across the airfield. A Wellington bomber sat ready on the tarmac, its engines idling with a deep, steady growl. The ground crew moved around it like ghosts in the fog, fuel lines coiled like serpents, tools clattering softly in metal trays. Jerzy climbed into the aircraft's narrow interior, clutching the prototype sights as if they were crown jewels. Inside the cockpit, the pilot, a young Englishman named Flight Lieutenant Graham Wild, glanced over his shoulder. "You must be the Polish chap they've been whispering about, the one who might let us actually hit what we're aiming at?" Jerzy managed a faint smile. "That is the idea, Lieutenant." They lifted off moments later. The bomber's engines roared, rattling the fuselage as it climbed through the thinning fog. Below them, London stretched out, a wounded, defiant city. Columns of smoke rose from burning districts, merging with the morning haze. Inside the bomb bay, Jerzy and an ARF technician secured the site to a reinforced mount. The device gleamed faintly, its brass fittings catching the dim light that crept through the fuselage. Wild's voice crackled over the intercom. "Test run begins in 30 seconds. Bomb bay doors opening. A low hydraulic groan filled the aircraft. Cold air swept in. The ground, 12,000 feet below, seemed to sway gently, like a living map shifting under their feet. The technician handed Jerzy the stabilizing handle. "Ready when you are." Jerzy leaned over the device. The horizon outside tilted, gusts buffeted the Wellington, but the crosshair inside the sight held steady, as if refusing to acknowledge the chaos around it. The Jerzy thus was a weapon he could fight with. The gyroscopic stabilizer hummed softly, correcting every shudder, every pitch. "Targets approaching," Wild called. Below, the chalk fields of southern England appeared, marked with white panels that RAF crews used for bombing trials. Jerzy adjusted the elevation screw. Steady. Steady. The sight glided like silk, not a tremor, not a wobble. "Release!" The test bombs dropped cleanly, spinning downward until they struck the center of the marked field with startling precision. Wild's incredulous laugh burst through the intercom. "By God, you've actually done it!" Jerzy allowed himself only a brief smile, but inside, he felt something shift. Not pride. Relief.
For the first time since exile, since the loss of his home, since the collapse of Poland, he felt useful again. He felt like a man who could still change the outcome of a war. The Wellington banked gently left, circling for a second run. The stabilizer held firm. The sight remained perfectly level. Every bomb fell almost exactly where the crosshair predicted. When they landed, senior RAF officers gathered around the bomber like hungry wolves. Jerzy stepped onto the tarmac to a wave of handshakes, nods, and excited voices. One officer, a stern man with a clipped mustache, leaned in close.
"Mr. Rudlicki, I don't know what you Poles are made of, but if Britain survives this Blitz, it'll be partly because of the ideas you brought with you."
Jerzy didn't answer. But he felt the weight of the moment. He felt for the first time that exile had not erased his purpose. It had sharpened it. RAF Boscombe Down, November 1940. The wind cut across the airfield like a knife, carrying with it the distant echoes of London's suffering, sirens, explosions, and the hollow pulse of anti-aircraft fire. Britain was still burning. The Blitz showed no sign of slowing, no mercy, no exhaustion. But inside the test hangars, something else was burning. Urgency and hope. Jerzy Rudlicki stood beside a row of identical brass and glass instruments, his revised bombsight prototypes, each one more refined than the last. Tools lay scattered across the bench. Jeweler screwdrivers, fine lens cloths, micrometers. His fingers moved with the meticulous confidence of a man who had rebuilt airplanes in wartime and entire ideas in exile. Around him, Polish and British technicians moved quickly, fitting the devices into bombers scheduled to fly that very night. Every hour mattered. Every plane equipped with the sight meant one more opportunity to strike back at the Luftwaffe. A British officer approached, tugging his leather gloves tight against the cold.
"Rudlicki, HQ wants as many of these fitted as possible. Bomber Command believes your stabilizer may improve night accuracy by 30%, maybe more." Jerzy nodded, but didn't slow his work. "If we can guide the bombs more precisely," he murmured, "we can cripple the Luftwaffe's supply depots, and fewer bombs will fall on your cities." The officer's gaze softened. "You're doing more for Britain than many men born here."
Jerzy paused, the faintest hint of melancholy flickering behind his eyes. Britain gave us a place to fight from. That is enough. Hours later, the night sky over the English Channel was a canvas of darkness and distant fire. A formation of RAF Wellingtons and Hamdens droned steadily eastward, their engines vibrating through every rivet and panel. Inside one of the Wellingtons, the new bombsight gleamed under the dim red lamps. Flight Lieutenant Wild, now a fervent believer in Rudlicki's invention, adjusted his oxygen mask and glanced back at his bombardier, Sergeant Colin Hargreaves. "You've got the Polish miracle sight tonight. Make it count." Hargreaves tapped the stabilizer unit lightly, as though greeting an old friend. "It's steadier than a nun's heartbeat," he joked. "I'll do my part." Below, the coast of France emerged from the blackness. Fields, roads, and small towns faintly illuminated by moonlight slipping between clouds. Anti-aircraft fire blossomed ahead in violent orange sparks. "Hold steady," Wild murmured. Flak detonations rocked the aircraft, jolting the fuselage. The bombers shuddered wildly, but the sight did not. Hargreaves leaned over it, his eye locked to the glass. The crosshair floated calmly over the target area, a Luftwaffe fuel depot near Lille. "Steady! Steady!"
A sudden burst of flak erupted just below them. Shrapnel scraped the belly of the Wellington like claws. Wild cursed. "We're hit! Starboard engines toffing!" "Target in sight!" Hargreaves shouted. "Release!" The bomb load slid free with a deep, metallic thump. For a moment, nothing. Then, a massive flash erupted on the ground far below, followed by a chain of explosions as fuel stores ignited one after another. Secondary blasts lit the clouds from beneath like lightning trapped in a jar. Hargreaves stared, breathless. Direct hit, dead center. Wild let out a shaking exhale. "We couldn't hit a barn at night last month. Now look at this." In dozens of bombers across the formation, the story repeated itself. Stabilized sights, accurate drops, targets destroyed. The RAF was finally striking back with precision. Back at the airfield, hours before dawn, Jerzy waited in the operations room. His hands were clasped behind his back. His eyes were fixed on the map board where colored pins marked the outbound and returning aircraft. One by one, the crews stepped inside, exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. Wild approached with Hargreaves behind him, both men still smeared with oil and soot. Wild removed his gloves and extended his hand. "Rudlicki, your device didn't help tonight." Jerzy's expression tightened. Hargreaves stepped forward, grinning. "It saved the bloody mission, that's what it did." Another crewman chimed in. "Hit our target clean. Haven't done that in weeks." Another. "Your sight gives us a fighting chance out there." And another. "The Germans won't like this one bit." Rudlicki took a slow breath. Not pride, not triumph, but something steadier, something deeper. Vindication. He had lost his country, but he had not lost his ability to fight for it, and for others. And tonight, Britain had struck back harder than anyone expected, because of an idea that followed him from a nation that refused to die. Spring 1941. London was still scarred, still trembling beneath the echo of bombs, but the tide of night raids had begun to shift. For the first time, reports of successful RAF missions outnumbered catastrophic failures. Factories were damaged, transport lines disrupted, and, most importantly, morale, so long battered, was quietly rising. In the quiet halls of RAF Bomber Command, officers pored over precision reports. Strike after strike showed smaller dispersions, closer impacts, and measurable improvements. One phrase appeared repeatedly in the classified notes. "Rudlicki stabilized bombsight. Effective."
Jerzy Rudlicki walked alone along the edge of an airfield near Hucknall. Dawn painted the sky in muted pinks and golds, reflecting off the polished metal of rows of ready aircraft. Each bomber housed a site he had designed, calibrated, and tested. Each one carried men whose lives and missions now depended on it. Behind him, mechanics adjusted the last instruments of the morning sorties. Pilots prepped engines, checked flaps, and rehearsed climb sequences. The air smelled of oil, fuel, and frost, a smell Rudlicki would never forget. He paused, fingers brushing the cold metal of a bombsight crate. Memories of Warsaw and Lviv came unbidden. The city skylines he had watched burn, the friends lost, the nation erased from maps. But here, in a foreign land, those memories had forged something new. A weapon not of destruction, but of precision, of survival. A young British officer approached, hesitating.
"Sir, the crews keep asking about you," he said softly. "They want to know who built the thing that's finally giving them a chance." Rudlicki shook his head. "It's not me they credit. It is the crews, the men who fly, the men who survive." The officer frowned. "Still, history will remember this." Rudlicki exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the distant runway where a Wellington taxied, preparing for another night mission. "Let it be history, then," he murmured. "But history alone is not enough. We must keep building, keep improving, keep giving them a chance." Over the next months, the Rudlicki's stabilized bombsight became standard issue across RAF night squadrons. Missions that once returned in confusion and loss now returned with measurable success. German logistics faltered. Factories were systematically damaged. Fuel depots, supply lines, and critical infrastructure fell with a new, terrifying precision. And through it all, Jerzy Rudlicki remained at his bench, adjusting, refining, and perfecting. A Polish exile, a man without a homeland, had given Britain the chance not just to endure, but to fight back with intelligence, accuracy, and courage. The Blitz would rage, the bombs would fall, but Britain, now guided by the steady hand of a visionary engineer, would survive. Because sometimes history turns not only on armies and generals, but on the brilliance of one determined mind, one engineer who, in exile, designed a lens through which a nation could finally see the path to survival. As Rudlicki watched the first bombers lift into the fading light, the wind carrying the faint scent of distant fires, he allowed himself a single thought. Poland may be gone from the map, but its spirit flies here, in every precise strike, in every mission that returns, in every life saved. And for Britain, that was more than enough.